So if we're following the same logic from game development where we move forward and abandon the last generation, as we've seen done in COD history about a decade ago from 360 to Xbox One and PlayStation 3 to PlayStation 4, Modern Warfare 2 this past year should have been the last Call of Duty title released on last generations of platforms, your Xbox Ones and PlayStation 4s. However, with all the console generational debates, it's always this tug of war in generational shifts of should they, shouldn't they? And ultimately, we saw Modern Warfare 2 on Xbox One and PlayStation 4. The same is happening again this year, however, as this may be the final year of developmental support on last generation consoles, but that begs the question, how does Modern Warfare 3 hold up on Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and all compared to the current generation and beefiest of PC setups you can have? Today we're diving into the realms of gameplay and letting you see firsthand how they look on each of these platforms. As we go along, drop your thoughts down below. Think we should have this game on Xbox One and PlayStation 4 and have one final year of last gen support? Not so much. Did the results surprise you at all? Let me know your thoughts down below. If you enjoy the video, you find it at all insightful, do me a favor and drop a like on it. And if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing for more comparisons like this, as well as full in-depth coverage of all things Modern Warfare 3 as we gear up for launch. I'd love to have you in the community. Finally, check out my friends over at G Fuel for upwards of 30% off your entire order with code Espresso. Now's a great time to grab a restock or try it out for the first time ahead of launch, gearing up for all your energy needs so that you can grind out the game come launch. But more on that a little later. For now, let's jump into Modern Warfare 3 and how it's an entirely different game depending on the platform you could be playing on. So let's start out with some testing baselines. Firstly, all the gameplay you'll see here is 120 FOV. We did a comparison last week where it was original 2009 to current 2023, and it was a mismatch in FOV, didn't really do it as much justice. We have common shots for value, so comparing different locations around maps, but using those same locations on each generation. Also, there's not nearly as much weapon inspect like last year's comparison. There's more of the world around it showing gameplay and also hopefully learn from last year's. But anyways, graphically speaking, before we even jump into it, I do partially think that we're still missing some texture packs that will be there at full launch of the game. There's some areas of the maps that just kind of feel off, and perhaps it is the case of that's actually what we'll see come launch with the full map release. But as a forewarning, know that it is possible that come launch there could be another graphical update to make the game look even better. But anyways, let's start with the PC showcase. Now this PC showcase is PC settings on extreme quality everything running on a 4090 GPU. So beefiest of hardware in this system to showcase what you can do as a sort of max. So far in the beta at least, this is the peak when it comes to graphical fidelity and output, offering by far the most customization of either scale, with the ability to customize how high or low you want your graphics to go on in order to accommodate your frames per second. PC's always had the most options of all platforms, and that doesn't change here with Modern Warfare 3. In terms of extreme quality, I think that everything pops. I think there's enough contrast, enough sharpness, and enough detail that even the most menial details can look impressive. Sure, perhaps at distance, the mountain ranges may not sing to you like other games' details. Things like the skybox of a state are drab and muted where it feels a bit bare, but the look of the game itself in the playable map, I think, turns out to be pretty good. The stuff way off in the distance, like the skyboxes and the sort of mountain ranges of the maps that are larger, that's just stuff that's always going to be like that. I mean, whenever you end up having maps at such large scale, like ground war maps, what's behind that is just textures built up like curtains hung up, where there's nothing there, and if you were to take your character model, you just fall through the earth. So any game dev and any map of any kind wouldn't have the highest res of textures or assets all the way out there because it means nothing. I will say though, oppositely, the game looks really sharp. There's a ton of detail whenever you have everything cranked up to extreme, but honestly, sometimes that kind of is a hindrance as well. In some cases on PC, more densely packed areas with so much detail like Favela can directly hinder that visibility, where you have so much detail going on that it may be hard to discern a player from a group of other assets or textures. That also comes down to the ability to pick and choose what you want. Most people won't be playing on extreme quality compared to the overall population across the player base of every platform. Now I will say, and this is nerdy, it's not really going to ever affect gameplay, and a few other ways you could probably put it to how this is kind of irrelevant but a cool sort of baseline for stuff. The water caustics on PC on extreme really stood out to me, with particles on each round and shell put into the water would splash in a neatly detailed way, creating that initial spray, but also the ripple effect of each round and where it reacted from. The same went for if you jumped into the water. You'd create that ripple effect in the water that was reactive based off of your landing spot. Same goes with if you moved in the water and other things just interacting with that. You also had the bubbles and the sort of flushing effects, which is a major attention to detail moment. And talking water, there were a few examples of this in the beta, but additionally at COD Next, the build we played with Warzone, it was nice the visibility was much better than the existing Warzone and Modern Warfare 2 visibility with water. But anyways, that is PC and the sort of high-end extreme that we'll see with this beta and the graphical comparison. But let's talk current generation consoles now, because not everyone's going to have multi-$1,000 gaming rigs. It's just not practical nor worth it in 99% of cases, especially for the average player. But that's where consoles come into play, and since 2020, PlayStation 5s and Xbox Series X's have been atop their respective platforms' offering and performance. Now, sure, initially they were incredibly hard to get a hold of, and not until probably the last year and a half or so have they been actually in stock on shelves for most people. But these platforms, while not as powerful as the highest end PCs, they'll do just fine and still are able to output the highest possible casual experience, if you want to call it that, graphics and performance by every measurable metric, still up there in the top percentiles of device playback and engagement, just again, not that top 1 to 5% systems per se. PlayStation 5, to me, while playing on PS5, it's a really enjoyable experience. Graphically speaking, it still looks good. I feel like there's some sharpness that could be added, some texture resolution that could be improved upon, but by all accounts, it's still pretty much crystal clear gameplay, and with the potential in these current gen consoles to allow for 120 Hz support, that's a big win for the console market and from a competitive standpoint, in my opinion. Texturally, you'll also notice some slight differences between the high-end PC versions, but all in all, it's still incredibly sharp and is great for console gameplay. One of the things that I do like is that while it's not a bank breaker, it still will pick up on the details like the slight textural differences in the sunlight when you inspect, say, the MCW or another weapon. It'll pick up that wear and tear of the brown and gray metal coverages, and you see those minor details around the bolts. That kind of stuff is still picked up on a stock PS5, something that you can just go and pick up from a Best Buy, Walmart, Costco, GameStop, wherever you're ending up buying your consoles from. That stuff still shows up very nicely. And while sure, trees and such, the textures may not be as thick or as full, there's still an abundance of high-res textures in the map as well. Water caustics, this is probably going to turn into a talking point here because the range will become so drastic. You'll see that you still have those individual shell splashes and particles flying up and reacting with each shot. Each individual splash isn't as detailed as the PC end, but again, that's pretty much to be expected. And honestly, I think overall, water caustics hold up pretty nicely. Reacting to shells and reacting to players jumping in the water, it's impressive for a console in my opinion. And honestly, whenever you take a look at it, it is a very still enjoyable way to play the game if you're looking for this sort of good looking experience in your gameplay. Now let's jump over to the other side of the spectrum here when it comes to current generation, the Xbox Series X. Now the people who love console wars are probably going to hate this next comparison because, well, it's about 99% the same as PlayStation. I think this year Sledgehammer and the supporting studios did a pretty solid job at making the experience pretty seamless across the board. It's only when you look deep and at the fine details that you'll see where one pulls ahead. The only differences I could immediately discern came down to a few console defaults and a few fine details. Naturally speaking, the base Xbox versus PlayStation outputs seem to have a bit different levels in contrast. Like PlayStation at base seems to have a bit more pop in those colors, whereas the Series X is a bit more washed out. It's a bit more like grayscale across everything, but that's not a huge problem. You can adjust those settings in your monitor to adjust that, apply filters, allowing you to clean that up sometimes, but it's something that when you watch it side by side, you'll notice there's that slight difference in them, but when you're playing respectively, you're probably not going to notice it too much. Because of this though, I feel like the Xbox Series X slightly loses a bit in terms of that sharpness in some areas. Like the water clips, while I'd say that the Xbox Series X has a slight leg up in the water reactions, a bit more defined ripples and splash effects. On a state, for example, it's definitely apparent that you can see the canary grass or fescue by the water there in that lake. That's just slightly more blended together. It's not as sharp. There's not as much definition in those leaves. Beyond that, if you want to get like super nitpicky, some of the definition again in the smallest of details, I'm talking like the scratches on guns. Whenever you inspect the MCW, the gray area by the trigger guards, there's like scratches on the guns, there's manufacturer text on the barrels, things like that, stuff that mean absolutely nothing to the gameplay, but in terms of quality, PlayStation has a bit clearer of an edge in the straight up shootout for that quality. You're able to discern that stuff a little better. It's not as washed out. There's a bit more texture defined in those assets. That's the only real kind of stuff that you'll see between the two types of outputs from Xbox and PlayStation. Other than that, again, they're essentially the same game 99% of the time when you actually look at the fundamentals and the gameplay experience. But other than that, one of our points of comparison, coming back to it, water caustics definitely held up nicely. Again, I think that when I look back at the footage, I noticed a bit more definition in the Series X versus the PlayStation 5. But again, first glance, either way though, both consoles for what they offer are great in terms of detail and bang for your buck. But that's been the current generation. I'm sure now at this point, this is where a lot of people have been waiting for. Let's talk about last generation. It's playable, but Man, you're going to notice some limitations for sure as we go through these. Now, PlayStation 4 Pro, let's start like half a generation back here. This version of the game I'd say is like 50-50. There are some moments where you'll absolutely notice differences in quality, but functionally speaking, it's not too bad on 6v6 maps in play. Ground war, longer distances where that heavier in-game rendering comes into play, you'll definitely start to see distortions and a bit tougher of a time to see players, but it's certainly still manageable. So firstly, the biggest question, functionally, can you play on this? Sure thing, but it just may provide you with a bit of obstacles along the way. But where you start to get the quintessential last-gen experience and what you think of is when you start to examine the side-by-sides of textures, the details there are, or lack thereof textures. So for a lot of things, it's not bad, honestly. Like the weapon inspects, you'll still see about probably 80% of the details. I was actually impressed with how sharp the weapons still looked, if I'm candid. They looked pretty good for last generation when inspecting those and seeing the textures on the weapons. But, well, again, for some of those distant textures and then some even closer ones, well, it's just not even comparable in some cases. Let's take the high density office of High Rise, for example. Tons of textures, tons of details around that room, not even comparing it to the high-end PC. But if you just compare it even to PlayStation 5, on PlayStation 5, you can read the books on that shelf from afar if you want to. But if you look at that same distance, the same place on PS4, it's all low poly models, textures, and assets that fill the space out just enough to be believable, but there's no life or depth to them. Same thing with, let's say, the carpet in that exact same spot, for example. You can see the pattern sharpness and detail is there tenfold compared to the PlayStation 4 version. But the funniest thing to me, though, is that when you look around the world, some items just don't exist. Like the lake and estate, the canary grass or fescue there, it just doesn't render in, which honestly might even be a point advantage for PlayStation 4 players if they ever come across that rare instance where someone's trying to camp in that grass. They'll just see the character model, not the grass itself. The only other mention that's pretty bad on both PlayStation and Xbox One is that you'll see sometimes exceptionally long load times for textures to render in, where sometimes it looks like you're just in a blob of the world and there's nothing rendered around you. Realistically though, that's all to be expected. You save gameplay experience by not losing mechanics or functionality. You don't lose frames per second in the gameplay smoothness, but you have to sacrifice some of that detail in the extras category to obtain that targeted VRAM ceiling with limited hardware. So is it the end of the world? Absolutely not, but it can produce a few chuckles. Now that was the PlayStation 4 Pro, a gaming experience that launched in 2016, but what about an original last-gen experience? For that, let's jump over to the Xbox One and where I dusted off my original that I got a few weeks after the launch of the console all the way back in 2013. Remember, this was like one of the first things I bought myself when I started college. It was one of those, you don't have anything to do, you don't ever do anything for you type of purchases that when you're 18, you're like, screw it, I'm an adult, I'm gonna buy it because I can, that type of thing. But this thing surprisingly still holds up well for me in terms of it performs, turns on, but the gameplay experience, I can't really say the same. This is absolutely where you can tell that it's a last-gen version. Does it compete with or surpass the Black Ops 3 on 360 levels of cursed gameplay? I think that's probably for you to decide, but I'll tell you, it was miserable to play on as much as I didn't want it to be. I really wanted to be able to jump on and be like, this isn't all that bad. But the biggest thing that I found was ground war. I think some of the deaths that I had, I saw maybe like 1 to 2 people because the game struggles to render anything at a distance. Honestly, not even really at a distance. It's still really tough to do in regular 6v6 gameplay. You might see some back and forth from PC to Xbox One just to show the sheer discrepancy of a full-on showcase, but like trees and leaf textures wouldn't render in. There's no real definition to the water as it rolls in and crashes against the docks on Orlov's port side. Graffiti and paint are fuzzy and low res on Favela, and plenty of other examples we could give. I also found that I was skipping a lot of the infill animations, like the helicopters dropping players off or going through the elevators on High Rise, which I feel kind of has a split between connecting to a lobby late where you don't trigger it in the animation that happens, but also I wouldn't be surprised that it's based off hardware too. Like I feel like it could be a load bearing issue, like perhaps the console just can't support that, but that's assumption and speculation based off of anecdote of missing a lot of that in the games that I loaded into. This, for the console's sake, should be the last year I think we see this because it's trying its hardest and barely making it. The one thing though that did impress me, the minimal, was that for comparable water caustic testing on Estate, we already showed that on the docks in Orlov that it doesn't look all that good mixed with the minimal textures on the surrounding concreted areas, but Estate, you still had the ripples where the shells make contact, you still made the ripples where the players jump into the water, so even amidst struggling, while there isn't a sort of all that much high-end detail in these splashes, there is still some small details that manage to shine through, even if it's not a whole time. All in all, though, you can absolutely tell that this thing was just chugging along to the best of its ability, but is absolutely screaming the lyrics to the wedding singer, "Somebody kill me, please," as it's begging for mercy. But for what it's worth, the fact that a 10-year-old console is still pushing through and playing a game that's development for that console was surely an afterthought. It plays. It doesn't seem to drop too many frames, if any. I don't know that I noticed any, so the fluidity is still there. I mean, by sheer comparison, Black Ops 3 on last gen and 360 and PlayStation 3 only shipped with multiplayer and the launch of Zombies mode, no DLC, and only ran at 30 FPS. So for this game to get full support and still play at 60 FPS, again, assuming I didn't notice any drops or anything, honestly, kudos. But that's Modern Warfare 3 across the generational divides. Surprisingly, I think that a lot of it plays rather well, and while sure, there's a few glaring exceptions, most players are in good hands in terms of stability and fluidity of a build for this upcoming year, which definitely seems nice. I do think that there may still be a texture pack or a few missing that come launch. Quality-wise, we may see a few improvements to the game, but we'll have to see if time allows that. But for now, that's where we're at, and that's what we can see across the board, so I think that's what we're gonna call it. Before we wrap everything up, once again, make sure to check out my friends over at G Fuel to fuel all your grind this COD season. Whether you're grinding weapon levels, camos, content of your own, G Fuel's there to help. To me, G Fuel is like my cup of coffee in the morning. It just gets me up and going, gets my productivity going. And my team Carnage just recently launched our own flavor, Pog Juice, which is a pomegranate flavor, which honestly I might be biased, but I think it's a top 3 flavor of mine. Truly happy we can finally share this project with the world. It's been like 2 years in the making. So if you guys want to check that out or any other flavors, I'd recommend Hype Sauce, the Morbius Nectarine flavor, and a few others. If you want to check all that out, code Espresso can give you up to 30% off your entire order. Linked down below in the description if you want to check it out. But for now, that is what we're going to call it. So let me know your thoughts down below. What do you think of these generational differences between Modern Warfare 3 from PC all the way down to the original Xbox One? Whatever the case, drop your thoughts down below. But if you enjoyed the video, you find it at all insightful, do me a favor and drop a like on it. And if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing to stay updated with all things Modern Warfare 3 as we gear up for an incredibly busy next couple of weeks here leading up to launch and beyond. I'd love to have you in the community, but for now, thanks so much for watching. My name is Espresso. I'll see you later. Take care and peace.